Hello everyone, welcome to the 7th Brazilian Congress of International Tax Law promoted by the Brazilian Institute of Tax Law. The IBDT is a non-profit association founded in 1974 by Professor Rui Barbosa Nogueira with the purpose of developing tax law in Brazil. Today, IBDT is a reference in international tax law, offering both a specialization and master's degree on international tax law. This year's Congress has three main subjects: BRICS and new technologies, impacts of the US tax reform on OECD and developing countries, and finally, recently developments in international tax law. In order to provide an in-depth analysis of these subjects, each panel is structured as follows. A foreign professor introduced the main issues related to each subject, and afterwards, other speakers, Brazilians and foreigners, will provide some commentaries and share his country's experience on the subject. We hope you enjoy.
Olá, bem-vindos de volta. Teremos agora então a primeira sessão, parte 2, impactos. A doutora Luciana Rosa Nova Galhardo continua na presidência desta mesa, e nós temos também o doutor Joaquim English, da Universidade de Münster. Ele é professor de Direito Tributário, diretor do Instituto de Direito, na Universidade de Münster. Também o doutor Gustavo Gonçalves Vettori, professor da Faculdade de Economia e Administração da USP, professor de Direito da Fundação Getúlio Vargas e professor do mestrado do IBDT. Temos a doutora Natália Quinones, professora de Direito Internacional da Universidade dos Andes, em Bogotá, e sócia do Quinones Cruz, em Bogotá. Dr. Vikram Chand, professor de Direito Tributário na Universidade de Lausanne, Suíça. Dr. Brista Zhao, professor de Direito Tributário na Universidade Central de Finanças da China, e compondo a mesa também o Dr. Victor Machekin, professor de Direito Tributário na Academia de Direito de Kutafin, em Moscou, Rússia. Vamos aplaudi-los também, a formação da mesa, para esta nova sessão. Obrigado.
Muito bem. Em primeiro lugar, bom dia a todos. Muito obrigada pela presença. Bom, o objetivo dessa segunda etapa, no dia de hoje, é analisar os impactos da reforma em determinados países. Nós vamos analisar o impacto na União Europeia, na sequência no Brasil, e depois teremos comentários e impactos em relação à Colômbia, à Índia, à Suíça, à China e à Rússia. A única questão que eu vou pedir a todos vocês é um rigor bastante grande em relação ao tempo, porque nós temos até meio-dia para debater um assunto dessa relevância. Olha que a meta que nós temos à frente. Porque, infelizmente, eu tenho um avião que sai 12:30, então eu tenho que sair daqui correndo para o aeroporto. Mas muito bem. Muito obrigada a todos pela presença. Então, eu peço ao Joaquim, por favor, God with you, that you start with your comments.
Thank you very much, Luciana, for the wonderful introduction. There is always this prejudice that we Germans are on time. I would like to contradict it today and show you we're a bit more relaxed, but unfortunately I'm not allowed to. So I'll talk about the international impact of the US tax reform from a primarily European perspective, except of course for the Swiss perspective, which will be reported by Vikram, I guess. So what I'll do is I'll start with the most general features, especially the rate reduction. Then I'll have a look at the international tax law features, so these wonderful abbreviations, GILTI, FDII, BEAT. And then I'll close with a general view on how EU member states react to this reform, have reacted so far, will react maybe in the future. Well, again, I seem to be incapable of doing this. Okay, so,
No, I don't know.
Well, the magic fingers. Okay, well, when we talk about general features, of course, what are we talking about here? Mainly about the significant decrease in the nominal corporate income tax rate. So I'm going to cover corporate income tax only. I'm not going to cover individual taxes, because that's not so relevant from an international perspective. So we're talking about a huge decrease from top of the industrialized world to a world average, and actually way below a weighted OECD average. More in detail, how do you do it?
Sorry, I don't know. Let me try there.
I'll try it. So what do we have in terms of general elements that are relevant for the flow of international investment capital in particular? We have a permanently lowered federal corporate income tax rate from I think 35 to 21% now, plus on average, but only on average 4% state taxes as far as I know. And this is further enhanced, as Jaref has already mentioned, by the FDII regime, which means that for certain income from exports you get an additional reduction in the rate. And this will, as we shall see more detail on the next slide, mean that inbound foreign direct investment into the United States should become more attractive, and possibly, since we're talking about nominal rate here, also profit shifting to some extent from high tax jurisdictions at least, and also maybe IP shifting to some extent, at least in principle. Then we have immediate expensing, so basically cash flow taxation of investment goods, so you can immediately deduct 100% of the acquisition cost, and that also, since it lowers the effective average and marginal tax rate, should make investment in the US more attractive, so it should also increase foreign direct investment in the United States, even though there is a caveat, you can't really plan well with it, because there is a sunset. Actually the number's wrong here. It starts expiring in 2022, so it's phased out. Instead of the 100% immediate expensing as of 2022, you get 80%, and then you get 60% a couple of years later, and so forth. But for a couple of years you have this cash flow taxation in the US for all the relevant inventory and fixed assets. And finally, as has been mentioned, the US has in principle, or at least in name, shifted to a territorial system, even though there is limitations due to the GILTI regime, also to some extent due to the BEAT. But in principle, there's a territorial system. And this, on the other hand, should make other jurisdictions more attractive for US investors. So foreign direct investment from the US in other countries worldwide might become more attractive depending on the tax level of those foreign jurisdictions, because even now, if you repatriate, in principle, the tax burden will be determined by the foreign jurisdiction only. So if it's lower than the US, this should be attractive in principle. So we have an institute, it's called the Zentrum für Europäische Wirtschaftsforschung in Germany, and a quite renowned economist, Spengel, who runs it partially. They have made an estimate when the US reform was gaining shape. So what they did, they based their estimate on a corporate income tax rate of 20% instead of the final 21%. They did not take into account the FDII GILTI regime. They also did a static analysis, so they did not figure in possible EU member state reactions, tax competition. But still, even though with those caveats, so it's not exactly a reflection of what we have gotten in terms of the US reform, it gives you an idea of the trends and also of their magnitude regarding investment capital flows, what they estimated for the EU. And their estimate is that indeed inbound foreign direct investment from the EU into the US is supposed to increase by 30% due to the lower rate mainly. And on the other hand, outbound foreign direct investment into the EU from the US should also increase due to the territorial system, but only by 13%. So we see an overall increase in foreign direct investment involving the US, but asymmetrically, according to those estimates, in favor of the US. So there is, as a net result, a massive outflow of investment capital expected from Europe to the US, based on the assumption that the EU member states don't react, which, as we shall see, however, they start doing. And it's also important to see that this is not evenly distributed amongst all the EU member states, but the effect is much more pronounced for high tax jurisdictions. Why? Because the territorial system that the US have in principle shifted to don't make high tax jurisdictions so much more attractive, but of course they make low tax jurisdictions much more attractive as an investment location. And you can see it here with the figures for Germany and Ireland. They estimate that German investors will invest or increase investments in the US by 25%, but only receive a 10% increase from US investment, whereas Ireland, it evens out, more or less. So this is quite interesting to see. So it's essentially the US gaining here and high tax foreign jurisdictions losing. in terms of investment. So let's now have a look at the international tax law features, and I'll start with the BEAT here, the base erosion and anti-abuse tax as it's called. Jaref has essentially presented all the basics. Also, it'll be a small repetition. I'll try to keep it short. Nice. So it is sort of a de facto minimum taxation that is, the idea is that not every kind of payment to related entities is subject to the BEAT, but above a certain threshold. So excessive profit shifting, if you like, through payments to related entities will be caught and will be subject to a minimum tax of 5%, next year 10%, and subsequently 12.5%. And what's important to see, it applies regardless of whether you have a US parent or a foreign parent. There is an element clearly of international double taxation because there is no foreign tax credit for the amounts that are subject to the BEAT minimum taxation. So you have the minimum taxation in the US, but since those deductions will generate income abroad, this income will be subject to taxation abroad as well, so there is double taxation. Now, as Jaref has already mentioned, this is a treaty override quite clearly. This non-discrimination principle, in my view, also of Article 7 and 9 regarding company profit allocation. Well, Trump administration doesn't really seem to care about that. Jaref has confirmed that. And we shall see in the last slides why they might be relaxed about it to some extent. Actually, there is some talk, if you talk to some people close to the OECD or from the OECD, that the OECD is considering to actually propose that this might be an instrument to tackle certain aspects of the digital tax agenda, so especially excessive licensing fees. So they might have it in the 2019 or 2020 report as a possible tool to alleviate the challenges caused by the increased digitalization of the economy. It's not as yet certain, but they are seemingly thinking in that direction. Short comment from the EU perspective, this will be difficult to adopt for EU member states. Why? Because we have the EU treaties, EU fundamental freedoms, so you're not allowed to treat investment from abroad differently tax-wise than a local investment. So if you cap deductions or subject them to minimum taxation when they're from abroad, but you don't do it domestically, that is a discrimination problem. And the court is very strict here on the proportionality of anti-abuse arguments. So it would be difficult for Europeans to implement that, at least amongst the EU member states themselves. Okay, what's the expected impact or to be expected impact? Well, there's at least talks, not so much action as yet because we have uncertainty, but there's a lot of talk about tax planning going on, something probably the administration had not so much on mind because of the exceptions that have been mentioned. So the cost of goods sold exception, if your payment is for cost of goods sold, especially for inventory and other things that you are going to resell, and then it's not caught by the BEAT. So these kind of payments are not caught by the BEAT. So what do you want to do? You want to declare all the payments you make to affiliates as cost of goods sold payment. You want to transform them into that to the extent possible. And as Jaref has also mentioned, the non-marked up services are also not caught by the BEAT. Right. So what does that mean? That means a lot of planning is going on in all kinds of areas of corporate groups. So financing, since it only affects payments to affiliates, instead of financing from your parent, you might have parent guaranteed third-party loans. So they're not called the interest payments here. Or regarding the supply chain, if currently in your supply chain you have contract manufacturing, which is essentially a service, you might instead modify the contract so that the manufacturer actually owns the goods. And then what he does is he transfers title of ownership of the manufacturer's good to you, so it's cost of goods sold instead of a service. So this is something. Or you might want to embed the remuneration for IP in the cost of the good that you sell rather than as a license fee. So again, it becomes cost of goods sold. Subcontracting via a US entity for contracts carried out by a subsidiary abroad might not be attractive anymore, because then you have payments between the US and the outside, so you might have direct contracts between the foreign affiliate and the foreign customer, and so forth and so forth. A lot of thinking, not so much action, because we lack guidance from the Revenue Service in the US. They promised guidance, but they didn't produce it so far. And so a lot of questions are still unclear. How generous or strict will they be on the cost of goods sold definition? What can be included, what cannot be included? The non-marked up services, if you have a marked up service, does that mean only the markup is covered by the BEAT? Or is the entire cost for the service then covered by the BEAT? That makes a huge difference. If the entire thing is covered, you have to be really, really careful with your transfer pricing. If only the markup is covered, you can be a bit more relaxed about it. So all these things are unclear at the moment, so this is why not so much has been put into effect as yet. Okay, to the extent that some cannot escape, they will have an incentive to shift real activities. Why can some not escape? Well, because, for example, you don't have an equivalent for costs of goods sold in the services industry. So the services industry is more liable to be caught by the BEAT. In the financial sector, if you have US subsidiaries, the US requires you to have certain hybrid debt capital requirements. So the US subsidiary must issue hybrid debt for the foreign parent, which generates then interest payments caught by the BEAT and so forth. So some can't escape. And what does that mean? Well, since they don't, so no business will want to suffer from double taxation. There is no foreign tax credit, remember. So if you are taxed by the US anyways, well, better shift your profits there. So they're taxed regularly to some extent, but you don't have the double taxation anymore abroad. So again, it's a game of numbers, because then you would have the regular taxation rather than the minimum taxation. And also it might even be an incentive to shift R&D activities into the US. So that the profits that they eventually yield will be taxed in the US in the first place and not subject to BEAT when you license. And also it's an outsourcing incentive, clearly, since it applies only to payments to affiliates. This is economically maybe sometimes inefficient, but this is just a general comment. Okay, let's continue with the GILTI regime. As you can see, it's directed against too much profit shifting or IP shifting or R&D shifting into offshore jurisdictions in principle. Again, Jarif mentioned the core elements, so I'll keep it short. It's essentially a complement to the traditional CFC legislation, and it is targeting presumed, not necessarily real, income from intangibles. So how does it work? Well, basically it's quite simple, the idea at least. You have a look at all the tangible assets, or at least certain qualifying tangible assets. Whoa. I'm not seeing so well. All the tangible assets abroad of all the subsidiaries, of course, only to the extent, to the quota that you own them as a U.S. parent, so applies only to U.S. parents. And then you apply a 10% normal return on the value of those assets. And anything above that is an extra normal return, and it's considered to be derived from intangibles. Whether there are any intangibles around or not doesn't really matter. And this is then subject to the GILTI. And this goes clearly beyond to what the OECD has recommended. I don't want to go into details for reasons of time, but it shows again a certain disregard, or you might say contempt, for the BEPS recommendations of the OECD. There is a tax credit, but it's only 80%, and what does that mean in the end? There will be no US tax if the average, now that's really important, because there's cross-crediting. You can use a credit from one jurisdiction for another, so it's not per country. So if the average foreign tax on this extra normal return amongst all the subsidiaries is above 13%, there will be no US tax. In theory, then there are certain limitations to the foreign tax credit. There is also no carryover of the foreign tax credit excess, so maybe the real rate is somewhat higher, but this is the number you have to keep in mind. So an average of 13%, this is, so to speak, where the GILTI ceases to apply. Now, what does that mean? Again, it could be an incentive for MNEs to have certain tax planning. Yara have already mentioned the effects that some US commentators have called perverse, given the intention of the Trump administration, because it's now interesting to shift tangible assets abroad, because the more tangible assets you have, the more of your profits abroad are assigned to the 10% tangible normal return profits, which are not subject to GILTI. So there is an incentive to shift tangible assets, abroad. And of course, they're not going to be shifted to the tax havens because you don't need a factory at the beaches of some tax haven, right? So they're going to go to industrialized nations like Ireland or maybe Switzerland. And this is really not an effect, certainly the Trump administration had in mind. And it also might lead to planning regarding group organization or reorganization. So for example, if you have a US intermediary holding with then again foreign subsidiaries, those foreign subsidiaries are caught by the guilty because they have a US parent. So you might just want to have those foreign subsidiaries being direct subsidiaries of the foreign parent of the entire group, so you avoid the guilty that way. And of course, it makes corporate residence in the US in general a little bit less attractive. Is it a blow to the business model of tax havens, special regimes? Does that make IP boxes redundant from a US perspective? Because you have, again, this 13% ceiling. If it's lower than 13%, there will be an additional US tax. Not necessarily. So the excessive tax planning schemes of the past, where you would have an overall burden of 4 or 5% of your overseas profits, these become unattractive, and therefore some tax havens or schemes also do become less attractive. But again, we have an overall approach. So if you have part of your profits taxed in a high tax jurisdiction, then it's still very nice to have a tax haven or a special regime, IP regime in Ireland or whatever, for the rest of the profits. If the average of your overall tax level, tax burden, then boils down again to 13% or a little bit less, you don't have much of a US tax. So this is really, it doesn't really make the business model of the tax havens redundant. It doesn't make tax havens redundant from a US perspective. It just reduces their relevance to some extent. And of course, since it draws a bottom ceiling for attractiveness of such regimes, maybe, my guess is, tax competition amongst EU states might find a lower ceiling as well, to some extent. It's not coordinated with certain anti-BEPS measures. For example, in Germany, we have a royalty deduction barrier if the royalty goes to an affiliated entity and is taxed too low there. But too low is normally determined based on the taxation there. But what if the same entity is also subject to guilty in the US? We won't take it into account, so there's double taxation. Oh yeah, 1 minute now. Okay, FDII, Foreign Derived Intangible Income. It's, in my view, an IP box of sorts. So not a traditional one, but in a way, you get a lower effective rate for presumed intangible income. The idea is again the same. You have certain domestic tangible income. 10% is the normal return on that tangible income. Anything above the 10% on the tangible income, it is considered income from intangibles again, whether there is any IP or not. Doesn't matter what kind of IP there were, even if it's marketing intangibles or trademarks, whatever, everything's caught. Since it doesn't matter whether there's IP, it also doesn't matter whether there's a nexus, R&D wise. So it doesn't comply with any nexus requirements, and also it applies to all kinds of income from the exploitation of IP. Yarof has mentioned it's a forbidden export subsidy according to WTO standards. At least in spirit, it's incompatible in my view with BEPS Action 5 because it doesn't correspond to the nexus requirement. It covers all kinds of presumed IP income. Okay. Trump again doesn't care. Okay, I'll have to be a bit quicker here now. Yeah.
No, don't worry. No, don't worry. No worry, but you can finish for sure.
Okay, this is something a woman says, and you never know what she really means. Okay. I'll just pretend I understand it. So, what's the impact? Yeah, but thank you. I'm just kidding. What's the impact? Of course, since the calculation of the extra normal profit that can benefit is based on the overall profits. You have an incentive to shift profits in the United States, because the more profits you have there, the higher the portion of their profits will be extra normal profits that potentially qualify for the FDII, to the extent that you have income from exports. Forgot to mention that it's limited to income from exports. And also this might mean you want to have R&D in the US so that you can generate those profits, especially potentially high-yielding R&D. As has also been mentioned by Romero, there's probably not much incentive to shift back existing IP into the US. Why? Because the existing IP outside the US already usually benefits from preferential regimes, is located in tax havens whatsoever. And as we see, since guilty rates and FDII rates are strictly coordinated, The GILTI will not impose a higher rate on those foreign IP than would the FDI offer in the US, so there's no real incentive, in my view, to shift back IP to the US. But you might want to locate new IP there by locating the R&D there. And there is certain tax planning opportunities for US businesses using importation schemes if there is certain foreign manufacturing, but I'll skip that for reasons of time. Very briefly, the reactions to be expected. Wonderful. So I'll distinguish between defensive and offensive measures. As you know, there has been a lot of BEPS implementation in the EU, especially through the ATAD 1 and 2 directives, and in a way this gives short-term relief because it hinders profit shifting or IP shifting into the US due to exit taxation, strict transfer pricing standards, and so forth. But at the same time, of course, looking at the future, since you can't shift the profits and the IP so easily anymore, it's an additional incentive to benefit from the US by locating the real activities and the R&D there, so that the profits arise there in the first place. So in the medium and long term, this might actually be harmful for Europe. WTO, yes, the EU is contemplating to raise a complaint, but this is a lengthy procedure. It might further be hampered by the fact that the US is blocking the appointment of new appellate body judges, so in 1 or 2 years we might not have any appellate bodies procedures anymore because there's no judges around. And even if all of that is left aside, it has the potential to aggravate the already existing trade war. And certainly Germany is not interested in having high tariffs on German cars, so no one really wants that, which is probably why the US is a bit relaxed about the WTO challenge or threat. Treaty renegotiation. There's treaty breaches, overrides by the US. Yeah, do you want to terminate your treaty with the US because the US does that? Probably not. So they're relaxed about it because not much is going to happen here. So what's really happening is more offensive things. You have to then engage in the same kind of competition. That's the reaction that we see. The UK, France, Italy, Belgium, Sweden, not mentioned here, Netherlands, everybody is contemplating or has pledged or has legislated on lowering considerably, partially, the corporate income tax, with the notable exception of Germany. We're complacent, you know. We have Merkel's in 13 years, so nothing ever changes in Germany, nor does the corporate income tax rate. Also, IP box regimes are being maintained, are being just modified slightly to make them seem to comply with the Action 5 requirements, but essentially this competitive element is also maintained. Also, there is a lot of initiatives to have a lower average marginal, lower effective average and lower effective marginal tax rate by having R&D incentives, so super deductions for R&D to make investment also attractive in Europe, to have allowance for corporate equity to mimic cash flow taxation that we now have in the US, to have the same kind of effect. And so to make just investment here as attractive as it is in the US. And this is also part of the CCCTB proposal of the EU right now. And in my way, another measure by some member states is to push the digital tax agenda, because they want to have more taxing rights for the market jurisdiction, which also means that the beneficial regimes or the generally attractiveness of the resident state becomes less relevant, obviously, if you have more market jurisdiction. But again, here you have someone blocking, and that's Germany again. Germans are quite aware that expanding market jurisdiction taxing rights is not in the national interest, and so they kind of slow this process down. So I hope that gave you an overview, and thank you very much.
Thank you. So now let's see the Brazilian. Vamos ver agora os impactos brasileiros da nova legislação.
Fiquei assustado, eu achei que eu ia ter que continuar em inglês também. Bom, primeiro gostaria de agradecer ao IBDT pelo convite, na pessoa do Dr. Ricardo Maris, professor Luiz Eduardo Schwery, professora Luciana, restante da mesa, um prazer estar aqui. Então, o meu plano nesses 20 minutos é analisar 3 principais pontos. Então, retomar algumas discussões dos principais aspectos da reforma tributária americana. Muita coisa já foi dita, então não vou me alongar muito nos aspectos que já foram falados. Vou retomar alguns pontos que o Romero mencionou na palestra dele sobre a visão geral, a contextualização da reforma, para a gente entender alguns pontos importantes. Depois vamos analisar o impacto brasileiro, principalmente em 2 diferentes aspectos. o que a reforma representa em termos de planejamento para o Brasil, e profit shifting, e investimento que sai do Brasil e pode ir para os Estados Unidos, se isso pode acontecer ou não, e como isso acontece, e depois, em seguida, medidas defensivas que o Brasil poderia eventualmente adotar, seja medidas já existentes na lei interna, para se defender em relação a isso, e, no final, que é o que a gente já percebeu que provavelmente vai acontecer, que está acontecendo no resto do mundo, que o professor Joaquim chamou de medidas ofensivas e que principalmente são medidas de policy para acompanhar os efeitos de atração de investimento que a reforma tributária americana pode ter. Então, esse é nosso plano. E, em relação à visão geral da reforma, né, eu acho que o contexto histórico que a gente tem que colocar essa reforma é justamente, como o Romero estava falando, um contexto de tax mix e propostas diferentes entre o que acontece nos Estados Unidos, o que historicamente aconteceu nos Estados Unidos e o que historicamente aconteceu na Europa. Então, os Estados Unidos é um país que depende, ou historicamente dependeu, de imposto de renda da pessoa jurídica e não tinha um VAT, não tinha um IVA. Apesar da arrecadação do imposto de renda de pessoa jurídica hoje não ser alta no orçamento, mas se você analisar como um país que não tem o IVA, a gente percebe que os Estados Unidos historicamente adotava uma alíquota alta de imposto de renda da pessoa jurídica. Enquanto você vê na Europa uma situação um pouco diferente, você tem IVA em todos os países e isso permite uma alíquota de imposto de renda da pessoa jurídica um pouco mais baixa e, paralelamente a isso, regimes territoriais. Qual que é o problema disso? IVA é um tributo que você pode ajustar pelo princípio do destino. O que significa isso? Você não onera a produção nacional com IVA, se o produto é exportado, ele não sai com IVA. Se o produto é consumido no mercado interno, seja ele nacional ou importado, ele vai ter a mesma carga de IVA. Então, a ideia é ser um tributo sobre o consumo nacional e não sobre a produção nacional. O imposto de renda da pessoa jurídica, por outro lado, ele funciona na lógica inversa. Ele é um tributo origem, ele é um tributo sobre a produção nacional. E aí, a teoria clássica vai falar, não, na verdade, o IVA incide sobre o produto, mas o imposto de renda é sobre o capital, sobre a pessoa física. Mas a gente sabe hoje que isso é uma distinção que não faz sentido. E que, no final das contas, se você consegue passar para o teu consumidor esse imposto, você vai passar, e se não, isso vira custo de capital. Então, você ter um imposto de renda ao invés de um IVA, no teu mix tributário, ele te torna um país que está tributando a produção nacional e não o consumo nacional. E isso, na visão geral da coisa, pode te prejudicar em termos de competitividade. E principalmente como nos Estados Unidos, se você só tem um imposto de renda, você depende disso daí e acaba deixando alíquotas altas. Então, esse é o primeiro problema. O segundo ponto é a tributação universal, que cada vez mais vira um estranho no ninho no cenário global hoje. Então, a alíquota alta é estranha no cenário global e a tributação universal também é algo que não se enquadra mais no cenário global. E desde o início, lá nos Estados Unidos, quando se propôs a tributação universal, nos moldes da proposta Kennedy, que é algo como o que a gente tinha aqui no Brasil, que tributa controladas no exterior sem diferimento e sem diferenciar renda ativa e renda passiva, desde lá de trás falaram, não, isso aqui não vai servir, porque vai prejudicar a competitividade das empresas americanas no exterior. Então, o investimento americano direto lá fora é importante, a gente não vai conseguir concorrer em países de tributação mais baixa, então vocês não podem tributar essa renda agora. E aí veio a ideia de diferimento. Só que o diferimento virou, na verdade, um incentivo para você continuar acumulando rendimento lá fora, investindo em renda ativa lá fora e não repatriando isso daí e não criando oportunidades dentro do país. Então, esse acabou sendo o cenário, e se você coloca esse cenário numa perspectiva do mundo pós-ações do BEPS, a coisa fica um pouco mais complicada, porque as empresas americanas dependiam, principalmente, para baixar a tributação da renda nos Estados Unidos, de profit shifting e do deferral. Então, no final das contas, você tinha uma alíquota nominal alta nos Estados Unidos, mas com estruturas internacionais, Apple e etc., acabavam alocando lucro no exterior, ainda que muito da pesquisa e desenvolvimento estivesse nos Estados Unidos, e esse lucro não era tributado por estruturas de profit shifting e deferral. Se o país mudasse as regras para seguir uma ideia de BEPS, de riscos, atividades, funções, etc., das duas uma. ou essas empresas iam acabar sendo tributadas nos Estados Unidos e a alíquota efetiva delas ia subir muito, o que ia prejudicar em termos de competitividade, e ninguém parecia querer isso, ou elas iam fazer as famosas inversões, que basicamente iam virar empresas estrangeiras, ou, na verdade, iam alocar atividade produtiva fora dos Estados Unidos. E essa era a grande preocupação. Então, esse é o cenário, e aí a gente tem, inicialmente, uma proposta que estava lá no blueprint do Congresso, de redução do imposto de renda para 20%, uma mudança para a territorialidade e um ponto importante que foi pouco mencionado, que é o expensing, que, na verdade, como o professor Yariv mencionou, todo ativo imobilizado que eu comprava, então máquinas, etc., eu não deprecio mais, eu simplesmente tomo a dedução no ato. Isso torna praticamente o imposto de renda um IVA. E na proposta do Blueprint, a ideia era realmente torná-lo um IVA. O passo final para tornar esse imposto um IVA era eu tributar pelo mesmo imposto as importações, que nessa proposta era simplesmente eu não permitia mais deduzir custos e despesas de importação, e nas exportações eu não tributaria mais pelo imposto de renda. Isso acabou não se tornando realidade, mas a reforma que virou lei, ela leva em conta vários pontos que já estavam lá no Blueprint, e muitas dessas regras acabam se explicando por esses pontos. Então, a gente tem uma redução para 21% do imposto de renda da pessoa jurídica, a gente tem uma mudança teórica para a territorialidade, mas com algumas exceções, porque a Subpart F foi mantida e as regras GILTI, que já foram mencionadas, foram criadas. A ideia de expensing, de eu tomar uma despesa logo que eu compro um ativo imobilizado, foi implementada, mas com algumas opções. E o interessante do expensing é que, ao mesmo tempo, eu limito deduções de juros, porque não faz sentido eu tomar imediatamente uma despesa pelo ativo imobilizado que eu comprei, e se eu financiei, eu ainda deduzi os juros. Então, eu acabo com o problema da dedução dos juros e eu acabo sendo, teoricamente, mais BEPS compliant. E o que se criou com o FDII, no final das contas, foi a ideia de incentivar exportações e criar uma patent box, mas de um jeito um pouco diferente do que estava no Blueprint. Então, no final, é essa reforma que a gente tem. E aí, qual as consequências para o Brasil? Acho que esse é o grande tema que a gente tem que pensar. E o primeiro ponto é difícil de saber agora o quanto de investimento isso vai atrair, a reforma é muito nova e com a guerra de tarifas tudo ficou um pouco mais confuso, mas é possível que o Brasil, com uma alíquota nominal alta, que a gente vai falar daqui a pouco, e regras, às vezes, tributação universal, etc., que diferem um pouco do padrão hoje no mundo, você tenha investimentos vindo para os Estados Unidos, tanto de atividade produtiva que poderia ser feita aqui, que vai para lá, mas também profit shifting feito do Brasil para os Estados Unidos. Então, um exemplo de estrutura. Se eu tenho uma empresa brasileira que atua na economia digital, por exemplo, ela desenvolve aplicativos e vende esses aplicativos em app stores ao redor do mundo e tem receitas também de publicidade ao redor do mundo. Tem investidores brasileiros e investidores estrangeiros. Se eu tenho essa estrutura, o lucro dela vai ser tributado a 34% aqui no Brasil. Como que eu posso ter algumas ideias de profit shifting, né? Talvez para reduzir a tributação desse lucro, eu poderia pensar numa primeira estrutura em que se criaria uma subsidiária no exterior, uma subsidiária talvez nos Estados Unidos, e é interessante os Estados Unidos em comparação com o paraíso fiscal, porque eu consigo receber o dinheiro nos Estados Unidos, e se eu incorporar, por exemplo, abrir empresa nas Bermudas ou qualquer coisa, a Apple não vai me pagar, essas networks não vão me pagar, então eu estar num país teoricamente sério é importante, senão eu não consigo viabilizar minha atividade.
Eu tenho laser aqui, se quiser, esse vermelho.
Eu vi. Obrigado. Então eu consigo receber o dinheiro, que é uma coisa importante, e teoricamente o meu lucro vai ser tributado a uma alíquota menor nos Estados Unidos, inclusive não a 21%, mas se eu qualificar isso com FDII Income, acaba sendo tributado a 13%. Agora, se eu uso uma estrutura de subsidiária, eu vou ser pego pelas regras CFC brasileiras. Então, isso aqui não é uma boa ideia. Eu tenho uma possível tributação de 30% sobre esses dividendos, quando distribuídos para a empresa brasileira, e no final do ano, as regras de tributação de controladas e coligadas brasileiras vão tributar esses lucros com ou sem diferimento, dependendo se isso for renda ativa ou passiva. Agora, eu posso fazer uma segunda estrutura, que é simplesmente colocar a controladora nos Estados Unidos. E a empresa brasileira vai ser uma subsidiária. A empresa brasileira pode continuar desenvolvendo, mas quem vai vender e ter a receita da venda dos aplicativos, etc., vai ser a empresa americana. Eu não tenho regra CFC brasileira me pegando nesse caso. Os investidores brasileiros possivelmente vão ser pessoas físicas ou fundos, etc., que também não estão sujeitos à regra CFC. Então, isso daqui não tem regra antidiferimento. Os investidores estrangeiros dessa empresa estão livres de tributação brasileira, e o que sobra na tributação brasileira, no final das contas, para pegar e evitar esse profit shifting, é só o preço de transferência. Agora, o preço de transferência não é forte o suficiente nesse caso. Você pega regras de preço de transferência em exportação para intangíveis, a realidade brasileira que a gente tem hoje é que a gente mal vai conseguir aplicar. Nem chega a ter método. E, obviamente, se você conseguir algo como o Cost Plus, alguma coisa assim, você consegue fazer um contrato de prestação de serviço entre Brasil e Estados Unidos, colocar um markup aceitável em preço de transferência no Brasil, mas o lucro efetivo você consegue deixar nos Estados Unidos e tributá-lo a 13% se for para vendas no exterior, ou a 21% no caso das vendas nos Estados Unidos. Então, é um exemplo simples, é óbvio que o diabo sempre está nos detalhes, mas pode sim ser usado como uma estrutura de profit shifting. E o interessante dos Estados Unidos, em comparação a outros paraísos fiscais, é como eu falei, você consegue receber pagamento, você está recebendo em dólar, e no final das contas, às vezes entra no plano de exercer uma atividade econômica lá. Então, na pior hipótese, se o preço de transferência te pegar, você começa a desenvolver o software nos Estados Unidos, que é o que muita empresa hoje brasileira, multinacional, está pensando em fazer. Então, pode ter algum efeito. Bom, medidas defensivas que o Brasil poderia adotar. A gente tem várias medidas anti-BEPS na nossa legislação, mas não necessariamente elas pegam todas as estruturas. Então, temos transfer pricing, CFC, regra de subcapitalização. Um ponto importante, a gente tem uma tributação na fonte relativamente alta em padrões mundo, então isso, para estruturas de earning strip em empresas brasileiras, por juros, etc., a gente pelo menos pega 15%, em royalties vai pegar acabando 25% com o imposto de renda mais CID. Então, tem algumas medidas defensivas, mas assim, inversões. E simplesmente alguém desistir de investir no Brasil e investir nos Estados Unidos, isso a gente não tem muito como lidar. Um ponto interessante é, nós temos lista negra de paraísos fiscais, tanto jurisdições quanto regimes privilegiados. E um país ser incluído na lista negra, ou um regime ser incluído na lista negra, pode implicar preço de transferência um pouco mais complicado no Brasil, porque você aplica sempre os ajustes, regras de subcapitalização mais severas, regras de controladas e coligadas no exterior mais severas, e uma retenção na fonte majorada em alguns casos. A questão é, a gente listaria os Estados Unidos? Nossa lista é por alíquota nominal de país, 20%, e hoje já foi reduzido, então não entra por alíquota. A questão é se regime fiscal privilegiado poderia ser incluído. Os Estados Unidos já é. Se você tem uma empresa nos Estados Unidos que é check the box para ser pass-through, não tem sócio americano e não tem atividade lá, isso é blacklisted hoje no Brasil. A questão é se um regime como o FDII, por exemplo, poderia entrar na nossa lista negra por ter alíquota menor do que 20%. O problema é que o FDII não é um regime inteiro que a empresa está sujeita, é algo que se aplica para parte da sua renda. E analisar isso como uma alíquota nominal do regime para feito de blacklisting não seria simples na minha visão. Então, eu tenho dúvida se daria, mesmo com o regime fiscal privilegiado, sem contar nas questões políticas que isso podia gerar, que talvez a gente tenha uma preocupação. Uma segunda medida defensiva seria ir para a OMC. Existe um histórico em subvenções de exportação americanas, os casos FSC e TI, de terem perdido no OMC quando a Europa contestou, e uma ideia seria falar que pelo menos o regime FDII é um subsídio à exportação, porque ele realmente é contingente em relação a receitas de exportação. O problema é que não parece uma solução viável também, muito mais pela OMC hoje. Então, a questão é se a OMC é viável, se um painel, a gente vai ter órgão de apelação para julgar, porque ninguém está sendo conduzido, ou seja, a OMC hoje não parece ser uma boa alternativa. E o Brasil tem o segundo problema de levar esses casos para a OMC, é que a gente tem os nossos subsídios à exportação na lei interna, que recentemente foram julgados pela OMC como contrários ao acordo de subsídios, não é imposto de renda, é em tributos indiretos, mas ainda assim a gente tem algum telhado de vidro nisso daí e esses subsídios nem todos foram revogados. Então, talvez a gente não queira levantar essa bola dentro da OMC. Bom, então, o que parece mais provável? Mudanças, como já foi falado, mais ofensivas ou mudanças de policy no Brasil. E aí tem 2 pontos que eu acho que vale a pena a gente chamar a atenção. Primeiro, um race to the bottom, né? A ideia é reduzir o nosso imposto de renda da pessoa jurídica para acompanhar o que o resto do mundo está fazendo, que no final, com essa redução da alíquota nominal americana, a nossa alíquota nominal de imposto de renda da pessoa jurídica ficou totalmente fora do padrão mundial. E o segundo ponto, e isso obviamente vai ter que ser discutido em conjunto com as propostas de tributação de dividendo. E o segundo ponto é ajustar o nosso regime de tributação universal para que a gente acabe sendo um pouco mais territorial e facilite um pouco a competitividade das empresas brasileiras quando elas investirem fora do país. Então, alguns comentários sobre esses pontos. Primeiro, nosso imposto de renda de pessoa jurídica, ele é alíquota nominal mais alto do que a média OCDE, mais alto do que a média América Latina, enfim, mais alto do que o que a gente vê nominal ao redor do mundo. É claro que muita gente pode falar, bom, mas a alíquota nominal não quer dizer nada, o que importa é a alíquota efetiva. Quantas empresas efetivamente pagam comparado com o lucro contábil delas. Mas mesmo quando você olha a alíquota efetiva, é discutível se a gente está ou não dentro do padrão. A alíquota efetiva no Brasil é uma discussão complicadíssima, porque a gente tem tipos de empresas muito diferentes. A análise de alíquota efetiva vai ser feita com empresas abertas, com empresas fechadas, lucro real, lucro presumido, então isso muda muito. E se a gente faz, como se faz em todos os estudos, só com empresas abertas, que é onde as informações estão disponíveis, a gente chega a uma alíquota efetiva em padrões de 15%, alguma coisa desse gênero, que é mais ou menos o que estava nos Estados Unidos. E o ponto é, os fatores relevantes para a redução de alíquota efetiva no Brasil, a gente tem a amortização de ágio, que é algo que, por jurisprudência, pode acabar. Se as empresas e veículos forem desautorizadas, a gente pode estar à frente de um fim da amortização do ágio. Alguns incentivos regionais específicos, juros sobre capital próprio, algum profit shifting e outras diferenças entre lucro contábil e lucro tributável, que é natural em qualquer lugar. Então, dizer que a alíquota efetiva brasileira compensa, eu não me convenço muito por esse assunto, por esse argumento, principalmente porque, na minha visão, a reforma americana vai descer a alíquota efetiva no futuro. O segundo ponto é, bom, mas tudo bem, a gente tributa a renda da pessoa jurídica alto, mas a gente não tributa dividendos, então uma coisa compensa a outra. E quando a gente analisa, realmente a gente isenta dividendos e o resto do mundo inteiro não isenta, isso acaba sendo verdade. Esse gráfico mostra a composição, imposto de renda da pessoa jurídica e tributação sobre dividendos em diversos países. A gente vê que o combinado é muito mais alto do que o brasileiro. O problema é o seguinte, faz diferença você tributar a renda da pessoa jurídica a uma alíquota baixa e tributar um pouco os dividendos, ao invés de fazer o que a gente faz, que é simplesmente tributar a renda da pessoa jurídica a uma alíquota alta e isentar os dividendos, principalmente no que tange a lucros reinvestidos. Então, enquanto o dinheiro está sendo reinvestido em atividade econômica produtiva, você tem uma tributação mais baixa. E a tributação dos dividendos permite um diferimento para essa diferença só no momento da distribuição. Por que isso é importante? Porque isso pode atrair atividade, isso dá... Eu sei que eu esgotei o tempo, 3 minutinhos. Isso aumenta a competitividade da empresa brasileira, isso pode atrair investimento estrangeiro e, principalmente, a gente vai ver, a tributação dos dividendos não é uniforme para todo mundo. Então, não necessariamente, por exemplo, o investidor estrangeiro vai ser tributado, etc. e tal. Então, uma possível reforma seria reduzir o imposto de renda da pessoa jurídica brasileira para níveis OCDE, ou seja, algo entre 20% e 25%, e tributar dividendos. E aí, óbvio, a gente pode ser mais ambicioso e considerar regras como expensing, limitação de juros e revogar alguns benefícios fiscais, mas isso não seria o principal foco. O principal ponto de uma reforma dessa, eu acho que são duas coisas que precisam ser ditas. Primeiro, as propostas que a gente vê hoje no Congresso falam em simples tributação de dividendos e não falam nada do imposto de renda da pessoa jurídica. Então, isso é péssimo, porque aí a gente não está respondendo ao que o mundo está fazendo, a gente só está tentando cobrir um rombo orçamentário. E o segundo ponto é os dividendos de quem que a gente vai tributar. Que nem toda empresa brasileira é igual. O professor Scaff publicou ontem um artigo no Valor Econômico exatamente sobre esse tema. E, na verdade, a nossa composição de empresas, a gente tem 3% de empresas no lucro real e o resto é tudo empresa no lucro presumido ou no simples. No entanto, em termos de arrecadação, esses 3% representam quase 80% da arrecadação federal. Então, o ponto é assim, o dividendo de quem vai ser tributado, de quem que a gente está falando? E a gente está falando desses 3%. E, geralmente, quando se fala mundialmente em tributação de dividendo, fala-se nas empresas abertas, principalmente, que não é 3%, é 0,01% em número de empresas. São 350 empresas brasileiras. Então, eu acho que essas reformas têm que levar em conta isso, porque o remédio para lucro presumido e simples é um, e o remédio para lucro real em empresas abertas é outro. E o último ponto que eu queria falar, brevemente, é a gente voltar ou aumentar o caráter territorial da nossa legislação. Em 2014, a nossa lei de tributação universal foi reformada, a gente permitiu algum diferimento, alguma mixagem de lucros e prejuízos e de créditos no exterior, mas a gente ainda é um país universal em muitos aspectos. Eu acho que tem dois pontos que a gente podia pensar para melhorar em termos de competitividade as nossas empresas e atrair, inclusive, investimentos. O primeiro é renda passiva e renda ativa. Ao redor do mundo, ou pelo menos quem adota regras como o Subpart F, a gente tem uma ideia de que renda passiva seria tributada, seria pass-through, e renda ativa seria diferida ou isenta, como se fez na reforma americana. O Brasil adotou uma regra que é basicamente o seguinte: você pega a renda passiva e ativa da tua controlada no exterior, considera, e aí tem um teste de 80%. Se ela tem mais de 80% de renda ativa, você difere. Se tem menos, você tributa. Agora, não é exatamente essa ideia, né? Então, eu acho que isso poderia ser modificado. E o segundo ponto, aqui só encerrando, é o crédito presumido que a gente dá para determinadas controladas. Então, nosso legislador escolheu alguns setores e deu um crédito presumido de 9%. Se a gente pega uma média de 25%, e se eu consigo mixar meus créditos, minhas subsidiárias no exterior, vão ter uma tributação média de 25%. Se eu ponho mais 9%, dá 34%. O que significa que isso era uma ideia de, eu, sem dizer que virei territorial. Só que a gente fez isso só para alguns setores. E a questão não me parece ser o melhor jeito de legislar. Então, se a gente vai ser territorial, vamos ser para todo mundo. Então, eram essas as considerações que eu tinha. Obrigado.
Muito obrigada a você, Gustavo. Bom, como nós temos uma limitação de horário, eu só vou deixar uma pergunta para nós debatermos depois. Eu, particularmente, tenho grandes dúvidas em relação à tributação de dividendos. Eu confesso que eu não sei se essa seria a solução dos nossos problemas, ao contrário. Então, isso fica aqui para você, porque, por princípio, eu já seria contra. Então, depois, se tiver tempo, a gente pode voltar a falar sobre isso. Muito bem. Então, eu gostaria de chamar, por favor, a Natália, para poder fazer breves comentários sobre os impactos da reforma.
Muito obrigada. Thank you very much for the invitation, especially Professor Schwery. I'm really happy to be here in São Paulo again. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to be very quick on telling you what Colombia is doing after we heard of a U.S. tax reform. We're very quick to respond. We introduced a bill in the Senate about 2 weeks ago, which I will be discussing. But I think there's something that is very important to mention in order to assess the impact of this in Colombia. And I think, like in Brazil and like in many Latin American countries, the corporate income tax in general is a very small portion of our general tax revenue. We live off the VAT. Not really the corporate income tax. And yet, now that we've become an OECD country, the proportion of taxes that comes from corporate income tax and individual income tax are quite wrong, you know. Our individuals pay nothing, our corporations pay almost 90% of the direct taxes. So what Colombia has done is it's decided to become generous and tell investors, you know, whatever you can get there, we'll give you here. And if you don't like it, we'll go after you with the BEPS measures and anti-abuse measures that we already implemented in 2016. So you won't see any of the defensive measures that they've all talked about in these slides, because these are old news for Colombia. You know, we're quick. So when BEPS came out, we very quickly enacted a reform that, you know, made harsher CFC rules, implemented CBC, and most recommendations for actions 8 to 10 for transfer pricing. We have a very, very harsh general anti-abuse rule that's, by the way, being used by the tax administration in almost every case. There's some hint that some kind of abuse or base erosion is going on when they can't understand the business underlying anything. So anyway, we're trying to match the US benefits. So we're also lowering our rate. We can't go as far as the 21% that the US is offering, but we're offering a 30%, which is already lower than our 35%. And then we're offering a very low rate of 10% for agricultural and tourism businesses. So those that we really want to flourish and to stay will get a very, very low rate for 30 years, which is like a huge gift. We're also eliminating the AMT. So the US says AMT is no good. We say, okay, you won't have that here either. And this is huge news because there's many, many companies that are paying taxes under the AMT, same as individuals. And this also comes from the fixed assets regime that we used to have a few years ago. We had the immediate expenditure on fixed assets, and that made companies report tax losses. And so the AMT was being very important at this point. I don't have it here, but our new bill also proposes to renew the immediate expensing of fixed assets. And fixed assets is everything. For individuals, you know, a new apartment, even if you end up renting it, it'll be a fixed asset. In general, it's a huge, huge, huge cut that's very difficult to finance. The dividend dilemma that Luciana just mentioned, we're going quite the opposite that Gustavo was recommending for Brazil. We used to have no taxation on dividends till 2016, till December 2016. So for now, we've had 1 year and a half with dividend withholding. And now this bill is proposing to eliminate that again, so that will be more attractive for mostly what we call capital golondrina, that the passive investors. So we want people, you know, if we can't have them doing the real functions, having the DEMPI assets in Colombia, then at least let's bring the money over to the capital markets. And this also has to do with another proposal for our bill, which is creating a portfolio interest exemption, very much like the one they have in the US. So you Brazilians are very welcome to come and invest in the Colombian capital markets. There's no tax to be had there. If this is approved in Congress, we're expecting a final bill by December this year. So as you see, these are measures that Colombia is taking to make itself attractive for investors. And then if people want to leave or maybe restructure their supply chain, they have the general anti-abuse rule, and they have the transfer pricing where they'll have to be compensated. You know, if you want to get COGS instead of contract manufacturing or licensing, then Colombia will have to be properly compensated for that shift in assets and risks. And this proper compensation is to be determined by a regular person in the tax administration that has had absolute no contact with the industry or the real world, sometimes doesn't even speak other language than Spanish. So multinationals in general are thinking twice before restructuring their supply chain based on the guilty and beat. What we are seeing happening already are some, practice trends. That these are small changes that we're seeing. Family structures with a U.S. corporation, for example, are re-examining because of the new CFC attributions. They don't want a brother or sister corporation being caught under U.S. CFC rules, and they're also reviewing the check-the-box companies, Colombian companies that have checked the box under the U.S. regime to make sure that they are not bumping into the anti-hybrid rules that are now in place. So we're seeing, mostly family businesses moving very quickly with their check-the-box and restructuring their chain so that there's no attribution, CFC attribution, to brother and sister companies in the structure. Obviously, project finance is being restructured. They don't want to have interest paid out of the U.S., so what they're doing is, instead of having the borrower there, they just have a collateral being posted by the U.S., and that's a rather simple, shift to make. So most people are restructuring their financing this way. It was already mentioned by many of the people here, and we're seeing it in the market very often. And then some of the private equity and hedge funds that are coming out of Colombia, or Colombian investors having funds for U.S. assets, they are increasing the U.S. corporate blockers, so that there's a blocker above and below the funds, so that it's cheaper to have those blockers in the U.S. now. They used to have the blockers in BVI, Bermuda, Bahamas, and now they're being redomiciled, let's say, to the U.S. As regular corporations, so that foreign investors like Colombians can be shielded from U.S. taxation on their investments in the funds. So these are, I think, some of the impacts that we're already seeing, and like I said, we've been very quick to move, and we're still waiting to see how the defensive measures play out, because I think it's the same case in Brazil. We really don't have that many people that are trained and that have a good business knowledge to apply a GAR and determine if a restructuring was tax motivated or not, and whether the tax savings is larger than the business purpose. All those things that we're now discussing in litigation will probably play a big role with the movements that we're seeing here because of the U.S. tax reform. So this is something that I think we will be seeing a lot of in the next, I think, few months or even the next year. So I think this is very quickly what's going on in Colombia. And now Joachim and Luciana, you have extra time for the rest of the speakers.
Muito obrigada. Obrigada, Natália, muito claro. Então, agora eu vou pedir, por favor, para o Vikram Chand fazer seus comentários sobre Índia e Suíça. Your time.
Thank you. I'll try to give an Indian and a Swiss perspective, but before I get into that discussion, let me just briefly give you the policy background of the BEPS project and whether the intended policy background was actually attained or not, achieved or not. So one of the policy backgrounds of the BEPS project was to align taxation with economic activity, with relevant economic activity. And towards that end, if you look at the various BEPS action plans, you have Action 5, which introduces the substantial activity test for preferential regimes. You have Action 6, which talks about taxation in line with substance. And you have Actions 8 to 10, which talk about taxation in line with value creation, which basically means taxation where the functions, assets, risks are. So if you consolidate the concept of substantial activities, the concept of substance, the concept of value creation, this would lead you to the outcome that taxation should take place where economic activities actually arise. So what's going to happen? So the BEPS project basically has achieved this objective through these actions. So what's the impact of these actions? The impact of these actions is clearly tax competition, and this is what a lot of members on the panel have actually discussed. Now, states are going to compete with respect to attracting economic activity in the post-BEPS world. And this we can already see. So this we can already see, and it has also already been presented by the various panel members. Now, how can states compete with each other? So states can basically compete with each other on the basis of reducing corporate tax rates. They can compete with each other based on introduction of tax incentives, and they can also compete with each other through withholding tax reductions. So with respect to the first point, with respect to corporate tax reductions, you can clearly see this trend towards race towards bottom. Now, the panel members have already expressed what's happening in their jurisdictions. So like, for example, the US has dropped down the corporate tax rate to 21%. Similarly, Switzerland, which is undergoing a corporate tax reform right now, based on the corporate tax reform, let's say on average, the corporate tax rates would be around 13%. The lowest would be 13% in some cantons, where the maximum can still be around 18 to 20%. But let's say it's 13% in Switzerland in the post-BEPS world, the corporate tax reduction. Similarly, in India, the corporate tax rate is around, in the pre-BEPS world, it used to be around 35%, 33 to 35%. Now there's a discussion in India also to reduce the corporate tax rate from this 30 to 35%, to drop it down to around 25%. So you can already see this, this move towards, or let's say this race towards bottom, even in Switzerland as well as in India. The second way states will compete with each other is through tax incentives. And that's where so what are tax incentives? Tax incentives are basically regimes such as these IP box regimes, financing company regimes, holding company regimes, principal entity regimes, so on and so forth. So in terms of tax incentives, like the US has introduced the FDII, that's for intangible income. Similarly, India has also adopted the Nexus compliant patent box in Switzerland. In its tax reform is going to adopt the Nexus compliant patent box regime. So for IP related activities, there's going to be some substantial activities in both in India as well as in Switzerland through these patent box regimes. In Switzerland especially, in the pre-BEPS world, there were many regimes that were prevalent, like holding, financing, principal companies, and they were a bit artificial. So the OECD and the EU put pressure on Switzerland, and then Switzerland had to abolish these regimes, and the replacement measures were basically the IP box incentive as well as a reduction in the corporate tax rate. So that's the second way states compete with each other, is through tax incentives. Not much happening in Switzerland and India except the fact that they introduce the patent box regime. The third way states compete with each other is through withholding tax reductions. Now, in this whole discussion which took place here, I understood that the US has not really reduced any of its withholding tax rates. So it's for FDAP income, probably it's around still 30%, if I'm not mistaken. And but if you compare this with Switzerland, on outbound dividend distributions in Switzerland, the withholding tax rate is still 35%, and that is really high from a Swiss perspective. So probably in the future, maybe there's a discussion on reducing this rate and doing something what the Netherlands has done. And what I understand what the Netherlands has done is that they've reduced they've abolished withholding taxes on outbound dividends planning to do so, yeah. So that's a plan. So maybe this happens in the future. On the other hand, in India, on withholding tax reductions, there's no dividend withholding taxes in India, but there's a dividend distribution tax. That's a tax on the company, which is also quite high. There's no plans to abolish that. That will still be there. With respect to withholding tax rates, on interest, royalties, technical service fees, if you combine domestic law and tax treaties, the maximum rates is around 10%. So on the withholding tax, I don't see any changes being made in India, but probably a change will be made in Switzerland, where maybe the 35% rate on dividends outflow may come down to a certain extent. So that's with respect to the tax competition background. And that's the impact of the BEPS project, basically. With respect to the defensive measures that we spoke about here today, defensive measures are with respect to the taxable base. On one hand, there could be defensive measures which would increase the taxable base in a country, such as a CFC rule, which increases the amount subject to tax. And on the other hand, you have another kind of defensive measure which aims at reducing the taxable base, that is through interest limitation rules. So on the CFC side, like the US has CFC rules, India doesn't have CFC, Switzerland doesn't have CFC, and I don't think there's any intention to introduce these rules in Switzerland and India. On the other hand, with respect to limiting the deductions or reducing the taxable bases, India has adopted the interest limitation rule proposed by the OECD in BEPS Action 4. Although it's clearly, there are a lot of arguments that can be made that it conflicts with the non-discrimination rule of the Indian tax treaties. Switzerland hasn't really adopted interest limitation rule, but there is a thin capitalization rule in Switzerland that's already there with respect to ensuring that excessive interest payments are not made out of Switzerland. So this is the policy background in India and Switzerland as compared to the US. And now, in terms of assessing the impact of the US tax reform on India or Switzerland, that's very difficult to estimate at this point in time. Clearly, like Professor English and Professor Browner have mentioned in their presentations, investment into the US would be more attractive, investment outside the US would be less attractive. But there's no publicly available papers in India or Switzerland which have quantified the impact of this decision, so it's too early to comment on that. That's about it from my side.
Thank you very much. So now I will ask to Brista Kau, Professor, please make your comments about China.
Okay, thanks, Chair. I think we're all fed up with guilty with beat. Let's have a China story. One is a short story, one is a long story. We have only 2 pages, you see. One is this, one is this. For the first one.
Perfect. You are perfect.
In the past 30, 40 years, why we started with 1978, because it's the opening up from the planned economy to a market economy by Deng Xiaoping at the same time, or 2 years earlier than Reagan in the US. And so since then we have the foreign enterprise income tax, the tax law. And then in 1993, it's the very important year, we have a division between the central and local government in terms of tax. And also we have the VAT system. In 2001, you all know that we have the access to the WTO. We are opening to the world, and the tax system are evolving to be marketized. And 2008, you all know that it's a financial crisis period. Then what is the next 10 years of China and also of the world? It's a dark day for the world and even for the globalization for every nation. I don't think so. If we put it in the long term, we are using the 5,000-year history of China. We use the US and China as a modeling nation or economy or society. The modernization stages are very clear. They are circling. They're having the starting period, the growing up, and the becoming mature internally, and then they are amplifying their influence, or they are going forward, outward, to what? To disappear in the universe of the growed up community. For example, you see the U.S. 1789, they get the independence from the British Empire. So they have the U.S. and until 1865, this is a preparation period for the U.S. economy, U.S. Politics. And the same case for China. We began our modernization period since the fall of the Qing dynasty by the Mandarin. Until 1949, we are preparing for the what? For the socialism and also planned economy. And also, you all know that 1860 to 1865 for U.S. is very important. It's an internal war. And also for China, the Nationalist Party fight against the Communist Party between 1946 to 1949. Then we have this, what we call is economical revolution. For what? For unification, for a whole system of economy. And of course, independence in 1789 and 1911, it's for the military and also the political unification and integration. And how about the turning point, the very important year of 1929 to the US and 1978 to China? What is the importance? Why is very important to modeling economy, society? Because culturally, they are having internal revolution culturally. So the U.S. having more governmental functions, more revenues, more taxes, and income tax the rate base higher and higher. But for China, from 1978, we are having a market system. We have the whole system of what? We copy a lot of systems from the U.S. and also we suffer from the system. And for the U.S., when the U.S. Politically, economically, and culturally body become very mature, it will go outside, go to what? To increase its influence to the outside world. Just like the community, from yourself, you have your family, you have your enterprises, you have a nation, you have your universe, and then maybe the whole world. Next period for that. But what will be the future? What will for the next 30 years in terms of China? 30 years left, 30 years right, and what is next 30 years? let's have a guess, the life cycle. So in terms of the U.S., we have the BEAT, the GILTI, the FDII, and what is China's prescription for the international tax system? As I told you yesterday, we have an idea of BEPS 2. That is, we from the base erosion and the profit shifting to the base expansion and profit sharing. How? It's not only a competition for tax revenue, or for the extra profit rate. I think it's a cooperation for better life, a cooperation for compromise between governments, between the MNE and the governments. Can it be possible? Very possible. Why? Because today's producing capability of every enterprise, every state, is more than that 50 years ago. We're having enough capability to feed the needs, the requirements of everyday life. The profit rate is not so high as in the past. 5% is a very normal profit rate for very big enterprises. If it's a long term, we stay together, we sit down, and we talk, we have agreements. We have more safe harbors. We use more formulary methods. Then the tax will be lubricating the business, lubricating the society. It's not only just for individual people and individual countries' earnings. So then in this way, globalization will be suspended. It's the end of the world? I don't think so. If the US is going inward to be more territorial to the left, and China is going to more universal and more to the right. So I think if we have this idea in mind, we can have a better future for tomorrow. So bon appetit for the lunch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So now the grand finale, Russia. Please, Victor, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, before this moment, it was pretty... Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Well, before this moment, it was pretty clear what particular regions were addressed. Latin America, Asia, Europe. Well, Russia is somewhere in the middle. Asia, Europe, sometimes we use European approaches, sometimes Asian. This gives us flexibility. Nowadays, it's a real value. Impact on Russia of all this US stuff. Well, I think that basically, if the UK tax specialists cannot understand what's going on there, well, it is impossible for outsiders to predict the impact. But I will try just to consider whether it's relevant to Russia or not. And definitely Russia is not offshore or low-tax jurisdiction. It sounds obvious, but it sounds obvious today. 10 years when we reduced our profits tax down to 20%, well, some countries seriously treated us as low-tax jurisdiction for CFC rules. But we were just among the states who started this campaign to reduce tax rates, because 20 years ago the rates were like 35%, 45% in finance industry. Currently we live with 20% in some regions of Russia, and Russia is a federation. It's possible to have even lower rates. So some industrial clusters, they rely on even lower rates like 15%, for example, 15.5. So we are not an offshore. We are not a jurisdiction with special regimes for finance companies. There are no any IP boxes in Russia, so, well, there are no much technology moved to Russia. Of course, in Russian tax, international tax planning, royalties are used very often, but mostly for payments for, well, logo, trademarks, and this stuff. I just checked, well, information about who is really, well, suffering US tax reform things, and it looks like pharma is really seriously affected, because in pharma industry all these IP boxes are really often used. But it does not affect Russia, because pharma, international pharma is not investing anything to the Russian territory from technology perspective. Russian anti-monopoly watchdog pressing international pharma to move some technology here. Pharma is not very happy with this. So typically some trading assets are moved to Russia, or some dodgy assets. Probably it is not what US Treasury is going to be moved to US territory. So what may be Russia relating things in this US tax reform? Well, typically international taxation related to Russian business is based on usage of European jurisdiction. So technically the biggest investor into Russia is Cyprus. It's #1 investor. So then there are, well, the Netherlands, you may see. So historically these type of structures were used to invest in Russia. As a result of this, many classical BEPS mechanics were used and sometimes are still in use, and a result of this, Russian income is moved to European jurisdiction and sometimes moves further to some islands. So probably this is something interesting for US tax people, and this part of structures probably will be affected by US tax reform, but it will not affect any structures directly dealing with Russia. What may be interesting for Russia? I think that, as in some other instances, well, tax practitioners may carefully watch what's going on in the States, because not surprisingly, some US mechanics becomes more popular later. And, well, in particular, bit mechanics, well, maybe something interesting for other countries, including Russia. And this rule for moving this old income, well, from low tax jurisdictions since 1986, well, I think it is something really interesting. Why not use the same mechanics in other states? Because, well, for me it looks, well, just incredible. Of course, as I understand, in the US context, US context, it is balanced. So maybe it's not very dramatic, so stick and carrot. But, well, for tax authorities it doesn't matter. They may say that, well, it is a very good stick. Why not use it? If US tax authorities use this, why not use it for our fiscal purposes? So I think it may be something really, really interesting. We don't have concerns like EU concerns, state aid. Well, it's not our territory at all. discussions about tax competition. Well, it's not for Russia. Those who invest in Russia, they invest in Russia. Of course, we have some elements of tax competition regionally, because, well, we have regions. So in domestic deals, yes, it's possible to look at some territories with very beneficial tax treatment. We have another aspect of tax competition, because we are involved in a project similar to EU. So some countries in the region, former Soviet Union states, they created analogy of EU. It is Eurasian Economic Union with similar principles, mostly dealing with indirect taxation. So direct taxation is not a hot issue there. But speaking from tax planning perspective, yes, sometimes foreign investors, they are deciding where to go, reaching this territory through, well, Russia or through Kazakhstan first. But again, it's not something where US reform will be important. So basically, don't see any real obvious impact on Russia resulted from this US stuff. Of course, in some structures, not very typical structure, there will be effect. Well, some Russians invest in the States, some states enterprises also thinking about investing in Russia, but nowadays it's not booming territory. I asked my colleagues from our neighbors of Russia. Well, some of them asked me, "Oh, U.S. tax reform?" I think yes, it's important. Oh, well, there is a reform there. It's not very important for us. If there are changes in Cyprus, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, well, it is really important for us, because almost all our business really depend on these things. And when there are even very small procedures, issues, well, it really becomes important issue for Russian tax practitioners. I have one message, general, it is more academic at this moment. When I see what US is doing, and not just US doing nowadays, well, you see, there is a conflict. States, when they treat their multinationals from tax perspective, I think it's obvious they treat them as enterprises. Yeah, what's US doing? These CFC rules and ordinary tax credits or participation exemptions. Well, they say it's our taxpayer. Full stop. But when we move to the source state, what we have? We don't have enterprise approach. We have an approach based on a particular organization, legal entity, taxpayer. I think there is a serious conflict which generates a lot of problems. And in the middle of this is OECD, which is a very strange animal. So if you look at OECD, it spends much time on multinationals. There are special reports on multinationals. Well, recommendations for multinationals, how to do business, how to do corporate governance, and there are parts related to taxation. And surprisingly, OECD says, in taxation, your entities located in other states should pay tax on the basis of this individual taxpayer. So when we move to the position of OECD in respect of taxation, we see that they just do not recognize this enterprise logic. I'm not sure that it is correct, and from Russian perspective, it is not a message which is really discussed by the government. Yesterday I explained that, well, government is not doing this at the moment, so it just does not have enough capacity. Probably later it will be back and think about this. But in academia, we are really thinking about this, and there are more and more voices about taxation of foreign multinationals based on this enterprise logic. Maybe something new should be created, and of course it may create new problems, but it may solve some current tax problems we face nowadays as a result of BEPS, as a result of something generated BEPS. So maybe we need to make serious step in understanding of international taxation and solutions for this international taxation. Thank you.
Thank you. Ok. So, eu gostaria de agradecer a todos os presentes pela oportunidade do seminário. Thank you very much for everything, also for you. If you don't mind, I will stop the panel today, but of course we are open for questions if you want. Thank you very much. Caso vocês queiram uma dinâmica de questões e perguntas, até pedir para o Gustavo tomar conta da presidência, mas fica aberta caso vocês tenham algumas perguntas. E eu vou me ausentar, infelizmente, porque eu tenho um compromisso. Muito obrigada. Lógico, você assume, por favor. Começa a responder, não.
Luciana, obrigado de novo.
Tenho uma pergunta para o professor Joaquim English e um comentário apenas sobre uma outra questão que mais nos concerne aqui no Brasil. A pergunta é o seguinte: foi mencionado a proposta, inclusive com referência à CCCTB, a proposta renovada do Allowance for Corporate Equity. E isso é algo que pode nos interessar no Brasil também. Por outro lado, também, quanto ao immediate expensing, que a gente vê no US Reform, se me recordo, na reunificação da Alemanha, houve o experimento do immediate expensing, eu não me lembro bem, mas que, se não me engano, há uma preocupação de efeitos distorsivos, de overinvestment, de forma ineficiente. Eu não me recordo exatamente se o caso foi da reunificação alemã ou não, ou se foi no leste europeu, com o alargamento da União Europeia. Mas qualquer comentário sobre immediate expensing seria muito útil também nessa ideia de ações ofensivas ou políticas fiscais que nós poderíamos ter. O comentário, acho que seria até, reforçando alguns dos pontos que o Gustavo colocou, sobre as opções de política fiscal, sem entrar em nenhum dos pontos específicos, mas eu queria somente salientar o trabalho nesse sentido que vem sendo feito pela CNI. Eu participo também, mas tem um trabalho extenso, indo inclusive reforçando diversos dos pontos que estão colocados aqui também e dando algumas opções, alguns detalhamentos também. E apenas quanto ao ponto do IR-fonte, realmente o estudo ele não pode ser superficial. Concordo, não só a segmentação por tipo de empresa, mas eu acho que a gente tem que separar a questão entre eficiência e equidade. A gente tem um tema de eficiência, de fato, tem lock-in effect, não tem lock-in effect, é o investidor brasileiro ou é o investidor estrangeiro, como vão ficar os tratados, por que é que os Estados Unidos e Suíça têm 30 e 35, o que isso causa na dinâmica dos tratados. Por outro lado, se não é um investidor estrangeiro que vai sofrer o ônus, a própria reforma da Holanda, tal, que vai sofrer o ônus dos dividendos, é o brasileiro, então tá. Então, é uma reforma de redistribuição da carga para pessoas físicas, vamos ser abertos com relação a isso. Então, acho que a transparência na discussão de eficiência e de equidade é o que a gente precisa fazer, salientando aí as publicações da CNI desde 2015.
Thank you for the question. I'm not entirely sure we ever had full expensing beyond small business schemes in Germany. What we did have was accelerated depreciation coming close, maybe to full expensing, over certain periods of time, including reunification as an incentive for investment. So basically speaking, if you increase depreciation or even up to full immediate expensing, you will lower not only the effective average but also the effective marginal tax rate, which means that your country on the one hand becomes more attractive for discretional investment choices from a foreign perspective, so you will be taken more into consideration for foreign direct investment, and on the other hand you also incentivize local investment just because you achieve a greater degree of neutrality as to other forms of using your capital. And so, as Jaref has already mentioned, if you have full expensing, essentially the state becomes a partner in the acquisition of the fixed assets. Yeah, that's the idea, to have a more neutral tax system, more investment-friendly tax system, both from an international perspective and from an internal perspective. And it is certainly something that is being taken into consideration, also because it's always a bit difficult to sell to the public to significantly lower the corporate tax rate, at least in Europe it is, or in certain European countries, for equity issues. So sometimes it's preferred to just lower the effective rate by way of, limiting the base or giving those extra incentives. And so I think this is also one of the reasons why it's in the European directive proposal, to become more competitive but to still give member states leeway for their nominal rates. Let's see, I mean, the prospects for CCTB are not really great. I don't think all 27 in the future will adopt it, but maybe a circle of nations that want to move on. And then it would be certainly an interesting element that increases competitiveness and also gives an incentive for more investment.
If I could say something short on the expensing of assets, we finished that in 2010, and we're still seeing companies carrying losses from those years. It was huge in its scope, and I think it's very hard to measure how much it's going to cost to have companies be able to immediately expense everything. We had to implement specific anti-abuse rules so that companies would not rotate assets between themselves. We had special rules for companies that used cost sharing for buying assets. We then had and are still having litigation over whether the asset produces income or not. For example, many companies bought buildings for their new offices, and an office building is not necessarily an income-generating asset. So we're still discussing those types of things. It was a very highly litigious measure, very, very expensive, and yet we're thinking of introducing it again because the states gave us the idea. So we'll see how it goes. But it was really hard.
Alguém mais? Eu tenho alguns comentários para fazer depois na questão do Romero e da Luciana, mas se alguém mais tiver alguma pergunta, eu queria dar prioridade. Só um ponto na questão da Luciana, no teu comentário. Assim, falar em tributação de dividendo é extremamente desagradável e ninguém, em princípio, é a favor, né? Ninguém quer essa mudança, e principalmente quando a gente coloca na perspectiva das reformas que estão propostas, que é simplesmente adicionar mais 15% ou qualquer coisa parecida, sem mexer em nada no sistema, como se isso fosse uma cura generalizada. Não é exatamente isso. A reforma de tributação de dividendo, ela tem que ser consequencial de alguma coisa que você quer fazer. Então, como eu falei, uma das alternativas é: eu quero reduzir o imposto de renda da pessoa jurídica para entrar no jogo do resto do mundo e, consequentemente, eu tenho que fazer alguma coisa em tributação de dividendo. Agora, de novo, quais empresas que eu vou fazer isso e quem vai ser tributado efetivamente, tanto em incidência econômica, como você falou, mano, e também não é necessariamente todo mundo que vai sofrer a própria incidência jurídica. Então, eu tenho contribuintes isentos ali em cima, ou fundos de investimento, alguma coisa assim, que podem não sofrer. Eu tenho não residentes, que talvez eu queira manter os incentivos, como, por exemplo, investimento de portfólio em bolsa de valores, talvez a gente não consiga tributar, senão o capital volátil vai embora. Então, talvez esse tenha que ser mantido. Mas e para investimento direto estrangeiro? Vai ser mantido? Aí entra uma dúvida de incentivo. Se a gente aumentar a alíquota, por um lado a gente está, como os Estados Unidos faz, dando um incentivo maior para negociarem acordo de tributação com a gente, o que pode ser interessante porque a gente ganha alguma coisa em troca. Então, hoje, não tributando dividendo, a gente a gente não tem essa tributação na fonte para dar em troca. A gente tem royalties em juros, em ganho de capital, que a gente geralmente não dá, e faz treaty override em royalties com a CID, mas em dividendos, que seria um ponto interessante, a gente não tem como negociar. E talvez a gente conseguisse alguma coisa do outro lado. Um acordo com os Estados Unidos, por exemplo, a gente conseguiria reduzir os 30%, que para muita empresa brasileira é importante. Então, assim, tem uma série de questões a serem consideradas e também de design normativo interno. Ou seja, você tem que mudar o sistema completamente. Não é simplesmente revogar o artigo 10 da 9249 e achar que vai dar tudo certo, como muitas propostas estão pondo por aí. É mudar totalmente o sistema. A gente vai ter que decidir o que vai fazer com o juros sobre capital próprio, que é uma mistura de dividend deduction e allows for corporate equity no mesmo sistema. A gente vai ter que, talvez, ter regra de subcapitalização interna, que é coisa que a gente não tem até hoje. A gente só tem para investimento estrangeiro. Vai ter que saber qual dividendo é esse, se é o dividendo do lucro societário ou vai ter alguma coisa como nos Estados Unidos tem, que é cálculo de GNP, para saber que é o dividendo. Tem um monte de questão que a gente vai ter que resolver que é necessário para fazer um sistema moderno de redução de imposto de renda da pessoa jurídica e tributação de dividendo. Isso sem contar em lucro presumido e simples, que, na minha visão, a cura tem que ser totalmente diferente. A gente está falando aqui de lucro real, lucro presumido e simples. Se o problema é que pessoas físicas estão virando PJs no lucro presumido para reduzir a tributação da renda, que seria ordinariamente renda do trabalho, na tabela progressiva, e estão usando o sistema presumido para gerar uma vantagem tributária, algo parecido que pode acontecer nos Estados Unidos em algum caso depois dessa reforma, assim, a cura é outra. A gente tem que discutir por que existe o sistema presumido em primeiro lugar. O simples do lucro presumido é uma alternativa à sonegação. A gente precisa ver se essa é a realidade hoje. E aí decidir o que vai fazer com aquilo, mas é outra reforma, não é a mesma. E estão jogando tudo no mesmo saco e falando que é só revogar um artigo de lei por 15% ali, está tudo resolvido. Não é. Enfim, esses eram os comentários que eu queria fazer. Se não temos mais questões, como prometido, 11h56 a gente encerra a sessão. Obrigado, gente.